Wait, what if the boring old XRP that we've ignored for years suddenly leapfrogs Bitcoin and everything else? Well, picture this. One tweak in the global money machine, tokenizing real-world assets, and XRP rockets to a price that nobody's ready for. All right, let me tell you the rabbit hole that I fell into last night. Now, I'm sipping a terrible vending machine coffee, scrolling X, when a kind of thread from All Things XRP slaps me in the face. Now, they're obsessing over a fresh Ripple BCG paper that kind of says that by 2033, we could see up to $18.9 trillion worth of real world stuff, that's homes, bonds, fine art, and carbon credits, sliced into little blockchain tokens. Cool hype, right? Now, I mutter this, but the post also drops a bit of a kicker. If XRP's ecosystem ends up handling just 20% of that pie, well, the math spits out a $3.78 trillion cash injection. My eyes actually do the kind of carbon popping thing, right? Or cartoon popping thing, I should say, because run the numbers. XRP at that kind of valuation with a full 99 billion supply kind of floating around, you kind of land at about $37.80 a coin, and it's pretty remarkable. And if Ripple keeps some of those tokens locked up, well, you're looking at around $54. So, cue me reheating that awful coffee because suddenly I'm wide awake. Now, tokenization isn't just a crypto buzzword or, buzzword bingo maybe, right? You've got to think of it like Netflix for finance here, right? Remember those old days, you're lining up at Blockbuster on a Friday night. Then one day streaming shows up and, well, the whole idea of late fees kind of evaporates. Now, tokenization does that for assets. You have 24/7 trading, instant settlements. You own a digital receipt that kind of never closes on the weekends. Now, JP Morgan, HSBC, BlackRock, Citi, none of these guys missed the memo, right? BlackRock's already stuffed their BUILDL fund onto Ethereum, and now they're experimenting on Solana too. So just December, 10 of those kind of banking titans, if you will, they test drove tokenized settlement rails, MasterCard and Visa included. So when the crowd with the deepest pockets is tinkering with new plumbing, you kind of usually signals that the mains waterline is about to shift. And here is where Ripple's XRP ledger strolls in like it's been patiently waiting in the lobby for years. David Schwartz, that's Ripple's brainiac CTO, keeps saying that the XRPL was built for exactly this, moving value cheaply at internet speeds and acting as a bridge currency when you've got A land tokens that need to zip over to B land holders, right? The ledger's already live, decentralized, and crucially battle tested, right? Plus Ripple's laying the liquidity hubs, and oh hey, we work with everything interoperability tools, right? So tokenized assets, they aren't stuck in one gated garden. But let's ground this spaceship for just a second. Why should anyone besides die-hard XRP fans really care? Well, it's because tokenization solves headaches that we barely notice until someone flips the pain switch off. So here's the kind of an example that hit home for me, right? A buddy tried to sell a slither of his family investment property, right? The paperwork took weeks, closing costs were absolutely ridiculous, and he had to wait for banks to wake up between weekends. Tokenization, I hear you say? Well, he could have minted those ownership chunks into digital tokens, popped them on a compliant marketplace, and investors from Dubai to Dublin could grab pieces in minutes. No fax machines, no bankers' holidays. We're talking liquidity on tap. And so, back to the numbers. $18.9 trillion, right? The Ripple BCG report's base case is $16 trillion, about 10% of the world's GDP. Now, analysts push it to $18.9 trillion when you add in their Yeah, but bankers always lowball multiplier, right? Even a kind of skeptic has to admit the direction of travel here feels locked in. Assets are morphing from paper to pixels. Okay, so let's play with the math together, because I love torturing my calculator as much as the next crypto degenerate. We'll keep things dead simple though, right? Let's take the $18.9 trillion ceiling, carve out 20%, and you're staring at $3.78 trillion. I actually triple checked because my brain refused to accept that chunk of change tied to a single ecosystem. Now, if we assume that there's no multiplier between inflows of capital and market cap, then we could just divide 99 billion by that kind of 3.78, and we end up, of course, at $37.80. However, if you check the most recent videos that we've been talking about here on the channel, you will know that there's a 600x multiplier versus liquidity in, or inflows in, versus market cap, which means market cap sits 600 times higher than the actual liquidity of a project. So if we were to see $3.78 trillion of liquidity added to the ecosystem, you could arguably multiply that by 600 times. Maybe even hell, just multiply it by 100 times. 50 times. You kind of get what I'm getting at here, right? $37.80 might be extremely lowballing XRP's price potential here, but let's actually suppose that Ripple follows through on gradual releases of tokens rather than having 100 billion out there. Maybe only 70 billion tokens are actually floating around by 2033. Well, the price could shoot up to roughly $54, right? And I could almost hear kind of the sound of keyboards exploding across crypto Twitter at this point. And of course, you could take that $54 and apply a multiplier from inflows versus market cap, which could potentially add, 10x, 50x, 100x, 600x. You could really just, minds and keyboards exploding everywhere. Now I hear you. Cool story, you say. But markets aren't math textbooks, I hear you say. It's true, right? There's a massive hurdle here, and it's regulation, right? If the SEC, decides tokenized assets are securities, or every jurisdiction drops its own playbook for this, well, we could see, a kind of blanket barrier, where XRP's utility kind of gets choked by compliance tape. Now, this is the tension, right? The infrastructure looks ready, right? The institutional giants are sniffing around, but lawmakers are still trying to figure out which fork goes with which plate. And that brings me to the moment last night that I nearly spat out my coffee. A Dutch chart wizard named 𝗕𝗘𝗪𝗔𝗡, has had a $38 XRP target on his chart for the last several months, based on a double bottom and a monster ascending triangle. Now, I used to roll my eyes at, the TA Eiffel Towers, if you will, but here's an kind of on-chain market thesis lining up eerily with an off-chain technical squiggle. And so let's humanize it, right? Imagine that you bought XRP at $2 today. Yep, around $2.15 at the point of recording today's video, right? You stash it, you forget it, you live your life. And then in 2033, someone texts you, dude, check your wallet. Right, suddenly each coin's flirting with $38. That's a 1,658% jump. Right, it's kind of like finding out that dusty Pokemon card in your attic could pay off your mortgage. Now, am I loading up the truck based on a single report? Absolutely not, because crypto's favorite game is rug, rinse, and repeat, right? But I can't unsee the narrative alignment here, right? Banks want efficiencies. Regulators, slowly, want transparency. And Ripple's been positioning XRP as a neutral bridge for a decade. Strip away all the kind of tribal noise, and it starts to read like those early internet days where everyone mocked online banking until Granddad started Venmoing your birthday money. And let's flip the lens to kind of a challenge that nobody's talking about. User experience, right? Tokenizing your house is sexy on a conference slide, but when grandma accidentally loses her private key, well, is the title deed gone forever? Well, institutions are actually working on a rekey custodial safeguards. Yeah, until those kind of safeguards are, well, idiot-proof, mainstream adoption maintains a kind of really tough climb. Now, tokens can supercharge liquidity, but they also demand new mental models. You got to think of teaching your parents how it was to kind of stream Netflix after decades of VHSs and DVDs, right? Multiply that confusion by property law. And Ripple's answer, it seems to be to abstract away the nargle bits. Like, you'll probably never ever kind of even realize that XRP is humming under the hood of your fractionalized Tesla stock. Right? Now, if they pull off what they're talking about here while regulators are lining up global rules, then yeah, 20% market capture stops looking like moon math. And here's the part that had me texting my crypto group at 2 a.m. By the way, you can join the insanity of our free crypto Discord. The link is chilling in the description down below. You can come and roast my coffee takes down there. Anyway, I asked, what market cap tips Bitcoin off its throne? Now, right now, BTC, it hovers around $1.7 trillion. Now, for XRP to hit $3.78 trillion, you need a scenario where real-world asset flows outgrow pure store of value narratives. Suddenly, those kind of dazzling orange coins look like, digital gold, still valuable, but overshadowed by the entire logistical highway. But let's go ahead and pump the brakes before euphoria melts the camera lens, right? Tokenization's biggest kind of tail risk is fragmentation, right? JP Morgan's building Onyx. Citi has its own DLT. BlackRock is flirting with multiple chains, right? Each giant, or if each giant kind of parents his own sandbox and cross-chain bridges remain well clunky, the liquidity that makes the 20% dream plausible, it kind of splinters off. It's VHS versus Betamax all over again. Except the prize isn't a movie night, it's actually who controls tomorrow's capital markets plumbing. And yet, the same risk is also XRP's leverage here, right? XRPL is chain agnostic enough and old enough, right? It could potentially be the Switzerland of settlement layers. Now, when you're kind of an institution staring at 1970s wiring systems, you need global liquidity yesterday. The path of least resistance, it often wins. Now, remember how email didn't become AOL mail or Yahoo mail protocols. Instead, SMTP just quietly ruled them all because university beats walled gardens every single time. And now, by the time that my coffee had ran out, I had 3 sticky notes on my desk. The first, narrative, right? Real world assets on chain are inevitable. Second, we had advantage, right? XRPL's been built for frictionless bridging since day one. And then post-it 3, variable, right? How fast can regulations, UX, and corporate policies align? Now, if 2 out of the 3 kind of break XRP's way, $37 isn't just clickbait fluff. It's a logical kind of waypoint, if you will. But if regulations drag or tokenization fractures into tribal kind of freedoms, if you will, XRP could remain a solid cross-border tool without ever touching 5-digit percentages. Either way, the next decade's kind of setting up a tug of war between status quo settlement rails and blockchain's turbo button. Now, I'm strapping in, popcorn ready, small DCA bag packed, and yes, I'm keeping the coffee stronger than my risk tolerance. But before I kind of wrap up, quick kind of reality check. Nothing here is financial advice, right? I'm just an over kind of caffeinated nerd connecting dots from Ripple's BCG PDF, some institutional breadcrumbs, and one too many late night kind of chart dives. But if you're as kind of curious as I am about how tokenization might reshape everything from your mortgage to your kind of Marvel memorabilia, buckle up, because we're all about beta testing right now. And that's the story, my friends, right? A $3.78 trillion what if hinging on the XRPL's bridging muscle, right? A regulatory dash and Wall Street's sudden blockchain crush, right? Will it kind of play out exactly as spreadsheet fantasy? Probably not. Will a kind of chunk of that tidal wave land somewhere? Absolutely. And if XRP is standing with a net the size of a small moon, well, you might want to know about it before the headlines scream, crypto passes gold.